In the middle of the 18th century, Bengal stood as one of the most prosperous regions in the entire world. Its cities bustled with traders from Arabia, Central Asia, China, and Europe, all eager to obtain its famed silk, muslin, indigo, and spices. The fertile soil produced harvests so plentiful that travelers often described Bengal as a land where the fields seemed to shimmer with gold. The royal capital, with its grand palaces and ornate markets, displayed a wealth that made even European merchants widen their eyes in astonishment. Yet, beneath this surface of beauty and abundance, Bengal was a kingdom where ambition brewed quietly, where certain nobles competed endlessly for influence, position, and recognition in the Nawab's court. Among these nobles lived a man whose hunger for power grew stronger with each passing year. Though respected and wealthy, he believed he deserved far more authority, more control, and a place closer to the throne itself. The court politics of Bengal were complex, filled with shifting alliances, whispered conspiracies, and silent rivalries. But this man had something the others didn't, an extraordinary ability to read opportunities as they unfolded. And in the shadows of Bengal's wealth, a new opportunity was rising, one that came in the form of a foreign trading company that was gradually extending its reach. The British East India Company had arrived in Bengal as simple merchants, but they were merchants with ambition. Over time, they had studied the internal structure of Bengal's politics, observing the tensions between nobles and the Nawab. They understood that the easiest way to conquer a strong kingdom was not through direct war, but through exploiting its internal weaknesses. The company officers noticed the noble's ambition, his restlessness, and his desire for more. They recognized him as the perfect key to unlocking influence in Bengal. Slowly and strategically, the company began approaching him. They spoke to him of partnerships, mutual benefit, and future possibilities. They praised his political wisdom, flattered his capabilities, and hinted that he deserved far greater authority than what he currently possessed. The noble was drawn to their words, unaware of how carefully each one was chosen. Their promises of gold, lands, and political power stirred the deepest corners of his desire. For the first time, he saw a path that could elevate him above his rivals, perhaps even above the Nawab. But he did not realize a dangerous truth. When foreign powers take advantage of internal ambition, they rarely stop where they promise. What the noble viewed as a personal opportunity, the British saw as a doorway, one that could lead them not only into Bengal's palace but eventually into the entire Indian subcontinent. And while the noble believed he was steering his own destiny, the first seeds of a 200-year transformation were being quietly planted. As the British East India Company slowly increased its presence in Bengal, the ambitious noble felt the tension inside the royal court deepen. Every decision of the Nawab was scrutinized, every political move discussed in hushed voices, and every advisor seemed to be quietly forming alliances of their own. In the midst of this restless atmosphere, the noble's desire for power began to harden from a simple wish into a consuming obsession. He believed he had been ignored for far too long. Despite his skills, intelligence, and loyalty, he remained just another court official. With every passing season, his frustrations transformed into a dangerous kind of hunger, the hunger to rise above everyone who had ever overlooked him. The British recognized this change in him long before anyone else did. Their merchants, though outwardly polite and humble, were experts at reading human weaknesses. They understood that foreign conquest does not always begin with armies, it often begins with ambition. Slowly, the company's officers began to cultivate a relationship with the noble. They invited him to private dinners, spoke to him with respect that he seldom received in court, and listened attentively to his grievances about the Nawab's administration. They made him feel valued, important, essential even. It was a subtle and calculated strategy, designed to awaken the pride he had long buried under court politics. In these secret meetings, they carefully planted ideas in his mind. They whispered that the Nawab did not appreciate him. They suggested that Bengal required stronger leadership that someone like him could provide. They hinted that the company, with its wealth and military strength, could support him if he ever chose to claim the position he deserved. With each passing conversation, the noble's ambitions grew sharper, clearer, and more dangerous. He began to imagine himself seated on the throne, ruling Bengal with authority and recognition he had always longed for. The noble convinced himself that he was simply seizing an opportunity. After all, in his eyes, he was not betraying the kingdom, he was ensuring its future success by placing it under his capable leadership. He believed that with the company's help he could remove the inefficiencies in the administration and establish a more stable reign. but deep inside he knew the truth he refused to admit. This was not about the kingdom, it was about him. His greed was no longer a private thought, it had become a path he was willing to walk, despite the shadows that surrounded it. However, the noble failed to see the full picture. While he was dreaming of power, the British were dreaming of an empire. They saw him not as an ally, but as a stepping stone, someone whose personal desires could be used to open a gate that had remained closed for centuries. The noble thought he was manipulating the British, but in reality it was his greed that was silently guiding the British into the heart of Bengal's sovereignty. The seed had been planted, and soon, the consequences of this ambition would begin to unfold. The alliance between the ambitious noble and the British East India Company did not form overnight. It grew quietly, like a vine creeping along a wall, unnoticed until it had already spread too far. Late in the evenings, long after the palace lamps had dimmed and the corridors had emptied, the noble would slip away under the cover of darkness. He moved with caution, ensuring no loyal court official or palace guard witnessed his secret journeys. At hidden locations outside the capital, he met with company officers who welcomed him with respectful bows and warm smiles, masking the cold calculation behind their eyes. These secret meetings became more frequent. In dimly lit rooms, heavy with the scent of ink and parchment, maps of Bengal were unfolded across wooden tables. British officers politely asked the noble for details, harmless questions at first about the geography, the river routes, the fortifications. But as trust grew, the questions deepened. They wanted to know where the Nawab stationed his troops, which generals were loyal, which were doubtful, and how quickly the army could mobilize. Each answer the noble gave tightened the invisible chain binding him to the British, and each detail he shared became a brick in the foundation of their future control. The British rewarded him handsomely for his cooperation. They presented him with chests of gold coins, fine European garments, and lavish gifts that fed his growing pride. They wrote letters praising his wisdom and visionary leadership, strengthening his belief that he was destined for greatness. To the noble, these rewards felt like signs of respect, proof that he was finally being recognized for his abilities. But the British saw them only as investments, tools to ensure his loyalty. They understood that ambition could be fueled with riches, and loyalty could be bought with flattery. In these clandestine exchanges, sworn promises were made, promises that would later echo through history. The company pledged that once they gained influence in Bengal, the noble would be elevated to the position he desired. They assured him that he would have full authority to shape the future of the kingdom under their friendly guidance. The noble believed them readily, ignoring the subtle warning signs. He did not question why foreigners would willingly grant him such power, or why they were so eager to offer support. His desire for the throne blinded him to the deeper intentions hidden beneath their polished words. Meanwhile, back in the Nawab's palace, political unrest quietly spread. Rumors began to circulate about strange movements, new shipments of weapons, and an unusual rise in British confidence. Some courtiers felt an unsettling shift, but could not identify its source. The noble maintained a calm, composed exterior, skillfully concealing the treachery he was weaving behind closed doors. His dual life became a dangerous game, one where a single mistake could expose his betrayal and cost him everything. Yet he continued, driven by a belief that fate was finally turning in his favor. What he did not realize was that the British had already anticipated every step he would take. They saw him as a pawn, a valuable one, but a pawn nonetheless. Through him, they gained access to the very heart of Bengal's defenses. Through him, they learned how to outmaneuver the Nawab. And through him, they prepared for the moment when Bengal would unknowingly open its gates to foreign rule. The secret alliance had been forged, and with it, the fate of Bengal, and eventually all of India began to move down a path from which there was no return. The day of the decisive battle dawned with a heavy, uneasy silence hanging over Bengal. Dark clouds gathered above the plains, as if the sky itself sensed the treachery that was about to unfold. The Nawab's army, known for its discipline and strength, assembled in impressive formation. Drums thundered across the campsite, elephants adorned in armor stood tall, and soldiers sharpened their blades with determined precision. Everyone believed they were preparing for a fair and honorable confrontation with the British East India Company. Everyone, except the one man who held the power to change the outcome before the first arrow was even launched. The ambitious noble, who commanded a crucial portion of the army, stood among his troops wearing a calm expression that masked the storm within him. His soldiers respected him deeply and waited for his orders with unwavering loyalty. They had no idea that their leader had spent the previous night exchanging secret messages with British officers. Every step he took across the battlefield felt heavier than the last, yet he pushed aside any trace of guilt. His mind remained fixed on the promises made to him, promises of power, authority, and a throne that he believed was rightfully his. In his eyes, today was not the Nawab's battle. It was the final test of his own destiny. As the British forces advanced, the Nawab rode to the front line, confidence radiating from his regal posture. Cannons roared, war cries echoed, and arrows sliced through the air. The opening clash was fierce, but the Nawab trusted the noble's division to strike at the perfect moment, precisely when the British lines would begin to crumble. Yet, that moment came and went. The Nawab waited for a signal that never arrived. Confusion grew in his eyes as he watched the noble's troops remain eerily still, unmoved by the raging conflict happening just ahead of them. Then, the impossible began to unfold. The British attacks grew bolder, their cannons firing with increasing accuracy, their infantry advancing steadily. The tide of the battle shifted far too quickly for the Nawab to comprehend. He raised his banner high, signaling the noble's division to charge, but the field remained silent. Not a single soldier moved. The noble, standing among them, pretended to be deep in thought, as if weighing the perfect moment to act. Yet he had already chosen his side long before the battle began. His betrayal was now in motion, irreversible and devastating. Panic rippled through the Nawab's ranks. Without the noble's division advancing, the army's carefully planned strategy collapsed. British officers, well aware of the betrayal, seized the opportunity with ruthless precision. Their troops pushed forward, encircling the Nawab's forces. What should have been a victorious stand for Bengal transformed swiftly into a nightmare. Soldiers fell, formations broke, and officers shouted desperate orders that drowned beneath cannon fire. The Nawab, once confident, now watched the battlefield unravel before his eyes, unable to understand why a trusted commander had abandoned him at the most critical moment. From a distance, the noble witnessed the destruction he had helped orchestrate. A faint sense of unease flickered through him, but he quickly smothered it beneath pride and ambition. In his mind, this sacrifice was necessary, a painful but essential step toward securing his future. He imagined the British welcoming him as a new ally, honoring their promise to elevate him to leadership. He believed that within days, perhaps even hours, Bengal would fall into his hands. Little did he realize that history rarely rewards betrayal with loyalty. As the final blows of the battle echoed across the plains, the Nawab's army collapsed. The British emerged victorious, not through superior strength, but through the carefully planted seed of treachery. Bengalis who survived the day would speak of the battle with sorrow for generations, remembering it not as a defeat caused by foreign might, but as a wound inflicted from within. The noble's betrayal had tipped the scales of power, opening the gates for an empire that would reshape the subcontinent for centuries. And though he believed he had won the day, the true consequences of his decision had only just begun. When the dust of the battlefield finally settled, the British East India Company stood firmly in control of Bengal. The victory they gained through betrayal granted them access to one of the richest provinces in the world. Almost immediately, company officials began reorganizing the administration to serve their interests. What had once been a thriving, autonomous region slowly turned into a giant revenue machine for a foreign power. The Nawab's treasury, once overflowing with wealth collected over generations, now lay vulnerable to British hands. The company wasted no time diverting Bengal's riches to strengthen its own military forces and expand its political influence across India. Meanwhile, the ambitious noble waited eagerly for his reward. He imagined that the British would greet him as a hero, the key figure who had made their victory possible. He pictured himself being crowned with honors, seated on the throne that had eluded him for so long. But reality unfolded much differently. After the battle, British officers met him with polite smiles, but the warmth in their voices had cooled. The promises of power, once spoken with enthusiasm, were now vague and uncertain. He began noticing subtle changes in their behavior, shorter meetings, fewer written assurances, and growing distance in their tone. What he had taken for genuine loyalty was, in truth, nothing more than a temporary convenience. In the months that followed, the noble's worst fears slowly materialized. The British placed him in a position of limited authority, symbolic but powerless. Decisions were no longer in his hands. Policies were drafted in British headquarters, and he was expected only to sign and obey them. Even his closest supporters began to distance themselves, sensing that his influence was no longer real. The noble tried repeatedly to remind the company of its promises, but each attempt was met with diplomatic excuses or gentle dismissals. Step by step, he was pushed out of the circle he believed he belonged to. At the same time, Bengal itself began to suffer under the new system. The company imposed heavy land taxes, squeezing farmers and zamindars alike. Traditional industries, once flourishing, collapsed under British trade restrictions. Skilled weavers, once the pride of Bengal, were forced to abandon their craft as cheap imported textiles flooded the markets. The wealth that once cycled through local communities now flowed directly into the company's coffers, leaving Bengal's streets barren and its people impoverished. Even nature seemed to rebel. Mismanagement led to severe famines, and thousands perished under policies that prioritized profit over human life. The noble watched all of this with a growing sense of dread. He understood, slowly and painfully, that he had not been a partner in shaping the future of Bengal. He had been a tool, a disposable facilitator. The very empire he had helped strengthen no longer needed him. The promises of power had been nothing more than bait to lure him into betrayal. And now, as the British expanded their reach across India using the wealth extracted from Bengal, the noble found himself isolated, powerless, and consumed by regret. The throne he had once dreamed of was now further away than ever, and the kingdom he had hoped to rule was slipping deeper into foreign control. This chapter of Bengal's history marked a turning point. It was not only the fall of a kingdom, but the rise of a system that would dominate the subcontinent for nearly 2 centuries. And at the center of this transformation stood one man whose greed had unknowingly lit the torch that guided an empire into the heart of India. Years slipped by like shadows across Bengal, and the consequences of the noble's actions grew clearer with every passing season. The British East India Company, now firmly in control, reshaped the land with policies that served only their greed. The noble, once convinced that he was destined for greatness, found himself standing at the edge of a world he no longer recognized. He watched helplessly as Bengal's vibrant economy collapsed under the weight of foreign rule. The markets that once overflowed with silk, muslin, and spices fell silent. Workshops that had thrived for generations closed as artisans abandoned their tools, unable to compete with the cheap factory-made goods the British flooded into the region. As poverty spread across the land, the noble's conscience grew heavier. He had once believed that his betrayal would lead to a better future, at least for himself. But reality struck him with brutal force. Instead of ruling over a prosperous Bengal, he became a powerless observer of its suffering. Families that had lived comfortably for generations were reduced to begging for food. Farmers, crushed by impossible tax demands, abandoned their fields or sold their land for scraps of survival. The noble had imagined that the British would govern wisely, stabilizing the kingdom he had helped deliver into their hands. Instead, the company treated Bengal not as a region to be nurtured, but as a vessel to be drained. Then came the famine, an event so devastating that it marked the land with permanent scars. Mismanagement, excessive taxation, and ruthless grain extraction turned poor harvests into widespread catastrophe. Starving villagers collapsed on roadsides, children cried for food that no longer existed, and entire communities vanished. Reports of the suffering reached the noble daily, yet he could do nothing. The British dismissed his concerns, insisting that their economic policies were necessary. They spoke of efficiency, revenue targets, and market stability, blind to the human cost their rules created. And in their cold calculations, Bengal's people became mere numbers. Every night the noble's mind wrestled with regret. He remembered how he had once dreamt of sitting on a throne wearing royal robes and commanding respect. Now he could not even command the simplest act of mercy from the foreign officials who ruled Bengal with iron pens. He understood with painful clarity that he had traded the soul of an entire kingdom for a crown that never came. The British had used him as a bridge, nothing more. The moment they crossed into power, they had no reason to keep their promises. And now, as despair spread throughout the land, the noble became a symbol of betrayal rather than leadership. His name, once spoken with admiration in the palace halls, was now whispered with anger in the streets. Mothers told their children stories of the man whose greed had allowed foreigners to take their land. Poets wrote verses comparing him to a shadow who sold sunlight for silver. Even his own family began to distance themselves, ashamed of the legacy he had created. The noble lived in a gilded house, yet it felt like a prison. Servants still bowed to him, but behind their respectful gestures he sensed distrust, resentment, and unspoken disappointment. In his solitude he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. His betrayal had not only cost him his dreams, it had cost Bengal its freedom, its prosperity, and its dignity. The damage could not be undone. The British Empire, now enriched by Bengal's wealth, was expanding with unstoppable momentum across the Indian subcontinent, and as the noble watched the world change around him, he realized that the empire he helped build would rule the land long after he was gone. His choices had ignited a chain of events that shaped the destiny of millions, and no amount of regret could rewrite the history he had set in motion. The British East India Company's grip on Bengal became the spark that ignited a vast transformation across the Indian subcontinent. With Bengal's immense wealth flowing steadily into their coffers, the company now possessed the financial strength to expand its influence far beyond the eastern borders. The victory that had once depended on a single betrayal was now being replicated through strategy, manipulation, and calculated exploitation. The noble, whose actions had opened the first door, watched from a distance as the British used the same tactics he had fallen for: flattery, financial temptation, and political division to weaken other Indian kingdoms one by one. Across India, princely states began to feel the subtle pressure of British involvement. In some regions, the company supported one heir over another, creating internal conflicts that eventually required British intervention. In others, they lent money to struggling rulers, only to demand territory when debts could not be repaid. They studied the political climate of each kingdom, searching for rivalries similar to the one they had used in Bengal. Where they found dissent, they offered support. Where they found ambition, they offered promises. And where they found weakness, they offered treaties that slowly tightened around rulers like unseen chains. The company's influence spread not through open warfare, but through quiet infiltration. The noble watched with a sinking heart as the same mistakes he had made were repeated elsewhere. In southern and western India, leaders who sought personal gain entered secret alliances with the British, believing they could use foreign power to defeat local rivals. They did not realize that the British had mastered a tactic far older than their cannons: divide and rule. Just as the noble once believed his betrayal served a greater purpose, these new allies convinced themselves that their partnership with the company was temporary and beneficial. But every act of cooperation weakened their kingdoms further, pushing India step by step toward foreign domination. The company's growing confidence was unmistakable. With each territory they absorbed, whether through war, deceit, or treaty, the British refined their methods. They improved their military discipline, expanded their administrative systems, and built networks of roads to move troops swiftly across the land. Indian soldiers, employed in large numbers by the company, found themselves unknowingly participating in the conquest of their own homeland. Meanwhile, British officials sent glowing reports back to London, praising the ease with which India's internal divisions could be exploited. They spoke of India as a vast tapestry, ready to be rewoven under British design. Back in Bengal, the noble felt as though he were watching a wildfire that he himself had sparked. The realization tormented him. His betrayal had not only changed the fate of his own province, it had shown the British a blueprint for conquering an entire civilization. His actions had taught the company that power did not always need to be taken forcefully. It could be invited in through cracks created by greed, ambition, or political disputes. The noble's choice had become a lesson for the British, and they used that lesson with ruthless efficiency. By the mid-1800s, large parts of India had fallen under British rule. Some regions were governed directly, others through puppet rulers, and still others through alliances that existed only on paper. The diverse kingdoms that once stood independently, each with its own culture, armies, and traditions, were slowly woven into a single framework of imperial control. The noble realized with crushing clarity that the chain reaction he had helped initiate was now unstoppable. The British Empire was no longer a guest, it had become the architect of India's political destiny. And as he stood watching the transformation of a once mighty subcontinent, the noble knew that history would not remember just his ambition. It would remember the empire that had risen on top of it, and the millions who would live under its shadow for the next 2 centuries. By the mid-1800s, the British Empire had established control over almost the entire Indian subcontinent. What took centuries to achieve was not just a result of military conquest, but also a careful web of political alliances, betrayals, and the exploitation of local divisions. Much of this foreign domination can be traced back, in part, to the ambitions of a single influential figure who, in pursuit of personal power, attempted to manipulate foreign powers for his own advantage. His greed and desire for status blinded him to the long-term consequences of his actions. As a result, loyalty to one's own people and country was sacrificed, and the seeds of foreign dominance were sown. History demonstrates time and again that when personal ambition takes precedence over collective welfare, entire nations can bear the burden of suffering. The British Empire, strengthened through cunning diplomacy and strategic betrayals, became a stark reminder of how fragile sovereignty can be when internal divisions are exploited. Families, communities, and entire regions experience the impact of this manipulation, learning a hard lesson about the cost of misplaced trust and unchecked ambition.